There are tears that come from genuine grief, and there are tears that come from guilt masquerading as mourning. Standing at my husband's funeral, watching his secretary, Rebecca, sob uncontrollably at his casket, I thought I was witnessing the former. It wasn't until 3 days later, when I found the hotel receipts hidden in his office, that I realized I'd been watching the performance of a woman who had been sleeping with my husband for the last 2 months of his life. My name is Catherine, and until that Tuesday morning when David collapsed from a sudden heart attack at the age of 45, I thought I had a solid marriage. We'd been together for 18 years, married for 15, and while we'd had our ups and downs like any couple, I believed we were committed to each other and to the life we'd built together. David was a successful real estate developer, and Rebecca had been his assistant for the past 3 years. She was young, efficient, and devoted to her job, or so I thought. She worked late hours, traveled with him to property viewings, and handled his schedule with what I admired as professional dedication. At the funeral, Rebecca positioned herself in the second row, right behind our family. She wore an appropriate black dress, carried tissues, and cried harder than some of David's own relatives. I remember feeling touched by her loyalty to him, grateful that he'd had such a caring employee who clearly valued him not just as a boss, but as a person. Several people commented on how devoted she'd been to David, how she'd stayed late to help him with the Morrison project, how she'd even worked weekends to make sure everything was perfect for his big presentation. What they didn't know, what I didn't know, was that those late nights and weekend work sessions had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with betraying the trust I'd placed in both of them. The funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning at St. Matthew's Church, the same place where David and I had been married 15 years earlier. The irony of that wasn't lost on me as I sat in the front pew, trying to process not just my grief, but the sudden, overwhelming responsibility of being a widow at 43. Rebecca arrived early, I noticed, and she looked genuinely devastated. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she'd been crying for days. She carried a small bouquet of white roses, David's favorite flowers, which I thought was a thoughtful touch from an employee who'd paid attention to details. During the service, I could hear her quiet sobs behind me. At one point, when the pastor was talking about David's dedication to his work and his relationships, Rebecca's crying became so intense that her friend had to put an arm around her to comfort her. "He was such a good man," I heard her whisper to someone. "He didn't deserve this. He had so much more to give." I turned around briefly to give her a grateful smile. In that moment, I was touched that David had made such an impact on his employee's life. It spoke well of the kind of man I thought he was. After the service, at the reception, Rebecca approached me with trembling hands and tear-stained cheeks. "Mrs. Davidson," she said, her voice shaking, "I just want you to know how sorry I am for your loss. David was an incredible man. Working with him was the best job I've ever had." "Thank you, Rebecca," I replied, squeezing her hand. "I know how much your support meant to him, especially these last few months when he was working so hard on the Morrison project." She flinched almost imperceptibly when I mentioned the Morrison project, but at the time, I attributed it to grief. "He spoke about you often. He loved you so much, Mrs. Davidson. He was always talking about how lucky he was to have you." Those words should have comforted me, but there was something in the way she said them, a slight tremor in her voice that suggested she was working hard to convince herself as much as me. "He was lucky to have you too, Rebecca. You made his work life so much easier. I can't imagine how he would have managed without your dedication." Rebecca's face crumpled and she excused herself quickly, rushing toward the bathroom. I thought she was overwhelmed by grief. I had no idea she was overwhelmed by guilt. The first few days after the funeral passed in a blur of casseroles, condolence cards, and the overwhelming task of sorting through David's affairs. I'd always left the financial details to him. He was the business mind in our relationship. So going through his office felt like archaeological work.
digging through layers of a life I thought I knew. It was on the third day that I decided to tackle his home office. I needed to find important documents for the lawyer: insurance policies, the will, business contracts. David had always been meticulous about filing, so I expected the process to be straightforward. I started with his desk drawers, looking for anything that might be relevant to settling his estate. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of old business cards, I found a manila envelope marked Morrison Project Receipts. I opened it, expecting to find construction costs, permit fees, the usual business expenses. Instead, I found hotel receipts. Lots of them. The Marriott downtown, the Hilton Garden Inn, the Westin. All recent, all within the last 3 months, all charged to David's company credit card under client entertainment expenses. But these weren't the kind of receipts you'd expect from business meetings. These were overnight stays, multiple overnight stays, and they were always on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, when David told me he was working on site visits or meeting with investors. I stared at the receipts, trying to process what I was seeing. Room service charges for 2 people, champagne, dinners that cost more than most people spend in a week, all on days when David had kissed me goodbye in the morning, telling me he'd be back late because of work. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and started cross-referencing the dates with my calendar. Saturday, March 15th. David said he was doing a site inspection with potential investors. Sunday, April 19th. David said he was meeting with contractors about drainage issues. Saturday, May 3rd. David said he was touring comparable properties with the Morrison team. All lies. All expensive, elaborate lies that involved hotel rooms and room service for 2. But who was the second person? David did business with a lot of people. It could have been clients, contractors, investors who needed to stay in town for extended meetings. That's when I found the second envelope. This one simply labeled R. Inside were printed emails between David and someone whose contact was simply listed as R. The earliest email was dated 2 months before David's death. Can't wait to see you this weekend. I've missed you so much. R. You know I feel the same way. Saturday can't come soon enough. D. I hate that we have to sneak around like this. I wish things were different. R. Soon, baby. I promise. We just need to be patient a little longer. D. My blood ran cold. Baby. David called someone baby in emails that weren't to me.
I kept reading, my hands trembling as each email revealed more of a relationship I never knew existed. I can't stop thinking about last night. You make me feel alive again. R. You're amazing. I never expected this to happen, but I'm so glad it did. D. When will you tell Catherine? I hate being a secret. R. Soon. I just need to find the right time. She doesn't deserve to be hurt, but I can't keep living a lie. D. I love you. I know it's complicated, but I do. R. I love you too, more than I thought possible. D. I had to stop reading. The room was spinning, and I felt like I was going to be sick. David was planning to leave me. He was in love with someone else, someone whose name started with R, and they were planning a future together. But who was R? I grabbed my laptop and logged into David's work email account. I still had his passwords, another detail of his life I'd handled without thinking much about it. I searched for emails to and from anyone with names starting with R. There were dozens of work emails with various people, but then I found the personal folder I'd never noticed before. It was labeled Personal-R, and it contained hundreds of emails dating back 2 months.
I clicked on the most recent email thread, sent just 3 days before David's heart attack. I'm scared, David. What if Catherine finds out before you have a chance to tell her? Rebecca. My husband's assistant. The woman who had sobbed at the funeral. The woman who had told me how much David loved me. The woman who had brought his favorite flowers to his casket. She won't find out, I promise, and after the Morrison project closes, we'll have enough money saved to start fresh somewhere new. Just trust me. David. I do trust you. I love you so much. I can't wait for our weekend getaway. Rebecca. Room 412 at the Westin, just like always. I'll be there Saturday at 2 p.m. David. I checked the date of that email. It was sent on Wednesday. David died on Friday morning. They were planning to meet that weekend. They were planning to meet just 2 days after my husband collapsed at his office. Rebecca wasn't crying at the funeral because she'd lost a respected boss. She was crying because she'd lost the man she was in love with, the man who was going to leave me for her, the man who died before he could break up our marriage and start a new life with his secretary.
I sat in David's office chair for what felt like hours, staring at the computer screen. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my husband, about the last months of his life, had been a complete lie. The weekend trips, the late nights, the stress he claimed was from work pressure, the distance I'd felt between us that I'd attributed to his demanding schedule, it had all been because he was living a double life, planning to leave me for a woman 15 years younger who worked 10 feet away from him every day. I thought about all the times Rebecca had called the house professionally asking for David about work matters, all the times she'd answered his phone when I called his office, all the times she'd been polite and efficient and helpful. She'd been sleeping with my husband while taking my phone calls. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was the level of deception involved. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a mistake that got out of hand. This was a calculated, ongoing relationship with plans for the future. They were saving money to start fresh somewhere new. They had regular weekend getaways. They had an entire secret life together. And I had been completely oblivious. I started thinking about Rebecca's behavior at the funeral in a new light. Her tears weren't grief. They were the tears of a woman who had lost the love of her life. Her comments about David being a good man weren't professional courtesy. They were the sentiments of a grieving girlfriend. When she told me how much David loved me, she was probably fighting every instinct to tell me the truth. When she said working with him was the best job she'd ever had, she was talking about a completely different kind of work than I'd imagined. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Rebecca's number. David had given it to me months ago in case I ever needed to reach him through his office and his cell phone was dead. For a moment, I considered calling her. I wanted to confront her, to hear her admit what she'd done, to make her face the fact that I knew the truth about her performance at the funeral. But what would the point be? David was dead. Their relationship was over whether I confronted her or not. My marriage was over whether I confronted her or not. The only question now was what I was going to do with this information. I could expose her. I could tell everyone at David's company what kind of person she really was. I could make sure she lost her job and her reputation. Or I could carry this secret alone, protecting the memory of a man who didn't deserve protection and a marriage that had been alive for the last 2 months of its existence. The choice was mine, and for the first time in years, that felt powerful. 2 days later, I called Rebecca and asked her to meet me for coffee. I told her I wanted to discuss some of David's business affairs that I needed help understanding. She agreed immediately, her voice full of concern and willingness to help. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from David's office and far from anywhere we might run into mutual acquaintances. Rebecca arrived wearing the same somber, appropriate attire she'd worn to the funeral. Black slacks, a modest blouse, minimal makeup. "Mrs. Davidson," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "How are you holding up? I've been so worried about you." "I'm managing," I replied, studying her face. "Thank you for meeting me. I found some things in David's office that I hope you can help me understand." "Of course. Anything I can do to help?" I pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between us. I didn't open it, but I watched her eyes flick nervously toward it. "I found some receipts," I said slowly. "Hotel receipts for the Morrison project." Rebecca's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. "Oh, yes, David sometimes had to stay overnight when he was meeting with out-of-town investors. These receipts show room service for 2 people, Rebecca. Champagne. Expensive dinners. Do you know who David was meeting with on these occasions?" Her hands were starting to shake. I'm not sure. He met with a lot of different people. Maybe investors brought their spouses." "On every single business trip? That seems unusual." "Mrs. Davidson, I am not sure what you're getting at." I opened the folder and pulled out printouts of the emails. Her eyes widened as she recognized her own words printed on the pages. The color drained completely from her face. "I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain how you stood at my husband's funeral, crying, telling me how much he loved me, when you knew you'd been sleeping with him for 2 months?" Rebecca started crying, but these weren't the theatrical tears from the funeral. These were tears of shame and panic. "Mrs. Davidson, please. I told you he was a good man who didn't deserve to die. But you were sleeping with a married man. You were helping him plan to leave his wife. You were part of destroying a 15-year marriage." "You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I understand that while I was making dinner for my husband, you were making plans to steal him from me." "It wasn't like that. We fell in love." "You fell in love with a married man. That's exactly what it was like." Rebecca sat across from me, tears streaming down her face, looking nothing like the composed, grief-stricken employee from the funeral. This was the real Rebecca, the woman who had been living a lie just as much as my husband had been. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "Are you going to tell everyone at the office?" I studied her face for a long moment. 3 days ago, I would have been furious enough to destroy her professionally and personally. But sitting there, looking at this woman who had lost the man she loved, even if she had no right to love him, I felt something unexpected. Pity. "No," I said finally. "I'm not going to tell anyone at the office." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you, Mrs. Davidson. I'm not doing it for you," I interrupted. "I'm doing it for me, because destroying you won't bring David back, and it won't undo the last 2 months of lies." I gathered the papers and put them back in the folder. "But I want you to understand something, Rebecca. You didn't lose a great love. You lost a man who was willing to lie to his wife for months, a man who was willing to betray someone who trusted him completely. That's not a love story. That's a character flaw. You don't understand how unhappy he was. If he was unhappy, he should have left me, honestly, not started an affair with his secretary." I stood up to leave, then turned back to her one final time. "And Rebecca, the next time you're at someone's funeral, remember that grief should be reserved for people who actually have the right to mourn." 6 months later, I learned that Rebecca had quit her job and moved to another state. I never saw her again. I kept David's secret. I let people remember him as a devoted husband who died too young. It was easier than explaining that my marriage had been falling apart without me knowing it. But I learned something important from finding out about David and Rebecca. Sometimes the people who cry the loudest at funerals are the ones with the most to feel guilty about. And sometimes protecting someone's memory isn't about love. It's about choosing your own peace over someone else's truth.
The greatest betrayals often come wrapped in tears and sympathy, making them harder to see but no less devastating when you finally do.
Did you like this content? Then subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos, leave a like, and share with anyone who needs to reflect on these family challenges. Together, we can transform our relationships.